let's dive into.
Hey guys, it's Khalil. Back at it again with Luka with another episode on Star Wars politics. We're going to be continuing our analysis on whether or not keepers of the peace can be soldiers. Just looking at a lot of case examples, looking at the pessimistic and optimistic view of peacekeeping, and whether or not the pessimistic side being like soldiers or optimistic side negotiators, where do they blend, which when is one more beneficial, and where in Star Wars do we see certain actors and certain institutions playing one side or the other, and really how it contributes to the Republic falling. This time we want to look um, at a few more examples than looking. We're thinking a little more of an analysis on Shams and and his freedom fighting movement on Ryloth, and then the possibly the Lurmen, and the Jedi and the Republic as a whole. We may not have time for this episode to look at all of them, but I don't know, Luca, which one do you want to take a look at first?
The Lurmen seem very, very fitting because we ended obviously last episode analyzing the passive um identity of Mandalore, and I argued how, personally the ideology seemed very fitting for maintaining peace, but obviously has its flaws when it comes to being at war, which is most of the Clone Wars. Is obviously, has a myriad of conflicts. But then the Lurmen give another example of a society, of a planet that is very passive, is a pacifist, has a pacifist identity, but it fails very much and at maintaining peace, because obviously the separatists come in and they undermine their sovereignty and just put a base there and attack the Lomans. And you can see in that arc, I don't know if it's an arc or just an episode.
It's an arc.
I think it was an arc, yeah. You can see how the Jedi are confused by their pacifism, contrary to Mandalore, where often, whereas in Mandalore, Mandalore is a more important planet. The Lurmen are basically a folk of little creatures that look a bit like oversized squirrels with Asian accents for some reason, but we digress. And they don't like the Jedis. They think they're the bringers of the keepers of war, actually, and don't want anything to do with them. They offer them help. Obviously, sanitation, as Anakin is injured this episode. However, they don't want anything to do with them, and they label them as the bringers of war, which they don't understand, because obviously Jedis believe they are the keepers of peace. Acceptingly, they do accept that, respect that opinion, and they leave them alone. However, they do see how the separatists are confronting them and actually attacking them, even though they don't want anything to do with it. They want to live on peacefully. Obviously, the separatists are the aggressors in this scenario and are inflicting violence and conflict and war. And the Jedi struggle with this whole idea of trying to help them, but the Lomans don't want to accept their help. So obviously they're being very passive, the Lurmen. However, you got to side with a more pessimistic view, because they're under direct threat of the separatists. And them, the Lurmen are led by an old man who's supposed to be, I guess, pragmatic, but obviously his philosophy doesn't work, and they're going to be attacked. And I thought it was a very interesting viewpoint, because similarly to Mandalore, the Lurmen they don't want anything, they're neutral. However, sometimes it shows how under war, neutrality doesn't matter. And Mandalore obviously is a stronger planet, but it really highlighted how the Jedi feel kind of conflicted because they're being viewed as, warmongers, even though they preach to protect peace and prosperity for the democracy. So that whole arc was very interesting to analyze the idea of, do they need to be soldiers? In this scenario, yes, they had to be soldiers, and they end up rescuing the Lurmen from certain death under separatist rule. And it kind of spikes into, your side of the argument, Khalil, where you can say that, you have to be soldiers at times to preserve peace. And I think that
Right.
arc really exemplified it.
Yeah.
Pardon?
I mean, like, not every arc does that, of course. Um,
Hmm.
as is commonly the theme with the pre-imperial era, is a blurring of the lines. And so even in this case, there's not totality in the idea that 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 to be a peacekeeper, um, you you have to not engage in warlike activities. So there's not totality on that, but in this case, it does help to support my point because if you speak softly, you have to carry a big stick, and this arc definitely does strengthen that idea. And that quote is from Teddy Roosevelt, but you know. You definitely see with the Lurmen that they're quite naive. They're even more naive than Satine. They avoid conflict at all costs, and it hurts them because that means that even when they're clearly being trodden upon, they their moral convictions refuse let them to let them engage, to let them move forward, um, to um, to bring about that peace again. And um, when you're responding to an unjust force being inflicted on you, and you want to be a peacekeeper, and you adopt certain policies and beliefs that the Lurmen do, um, you um, your number one inclination is to just not resist anything. Just let the aggression pass, let it pass over, and peace will once again be restored. Um, as long as you just go about it the path of least resistance. What the leader of the Lurmen fails to understand, though, and um, as was the creators of the show did this with this intention. They they made it so that the Lurmen had no choice but to fight because the separatists, not only were they just staying there to cause problems, they created a weapon that was meant to be used to kill every one of the Lurmens. They were going to test out a weapon that would be used against biological creatures. So the intention was to kill all of them. They were attempting genocide. And so they had no option but to fight. So in this case, it really does strengthen the idea that you can speak softly. You can approach your occupying force and say, we don't like what you're doing here. Why are you here? But if you are disrespected, if your warnings and what you say is not listened to, then you need to be able to back up what you're saying. You need to back up your words, or else you're just sheep.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I thought this arc really conveyed the necessity for pessimism when it comes to war, the real need for soldiers to restore peace. But other things I notice is that one of the reasons, the difference between Mandalore and the planet of Lurmens is that obviously Mandalore is of value and can defend itself, because they have soldiers to kind of protect that. Once again, conveying the idea of the necessity for pessimism during a time of war to, restore peace. So they would obviously have a better, peace because they don't have an army, not that we know. They literally use. I thought this episode was once again inspired by like the Seven Samurai, the typical idea of a village, which echoes throughout Star Wars, the whole idea of rebels and the people defending themselves against a tyrant. And it really overall showed that you need military to have peace in a way. They didn't have any military, nobody who could fight. They were just farmers basically, and it showed that against a tyranny, if you want to have peace, you need to you need to be pessimistic. You need to have a military. You need to be able to defend. You need to have a little bit of a factor, an element of fear to scare away aggressors, which Mandalore has to an extent, right? I mean, the armor, their soldiers. I forgot what the metal is called, but I know it's so valuable they trade it as currency even during Empire's times, right? We see that in the Mandalorian a lot. And another point that, yeah, Beskar, it's called Beskar. Thanks, Khalil. And another one is what I notice is that it's kind of highlighting the fallacy of the Republic in maintaining peace, is that if they weren't, this whole episode starts off after the ship of Anakin and the rest of the Jedi survivors crash lands on this planet. Imagine, the genocide, as you mentioned. Imagine if they weren't there, right? It shows this need for soldiers, a big number as well. Not just the Jedi are too few to be able to spread the galaxy, this big galaxy, and protect all these people that need protection, that don't have protection. So either the Republic needs more soldiers, and I think people will look at this scenario in the galaxy. If you're in the Senate and you present as an example of, it would go. There's another conflict we might touch on, is this idea of increasing the military budget, right? They wanted to increase the clone army. That happens during the Clone Wars as well. It's another arc we'll probably touch on, where Amidala does a very touching speech on why they shouldn't. My point being is that this example shows how you either need more soldiers to restore peace, or you need those people, that on a local level to build up a military or protection from to maintain peace during a time of war. I thought these 2 points were really echoed throughout this arc. So what are your thoughts on that, Khalil? Do you agree where you need this arc really showed that you need soldiers to not only keep peace but strengthen it even to an extent?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure looking back on this recording, I can totally see the chat messages I'm sending. But yeah, like the arc you're referring to is the peace negotiation arc, when Padme spoke with the separatist side, technically illegally, speaking to the other side in a hope to end the war, which it's its own interesting idea, something that actually fits along this idea of the optimistic side of negotiating. But it was actually a textbook example, really, and it fits with your side of this. But wait, sorry, what was your question again?
No, if you agree to the fact that you basically, this arc really shows that you need soldiers, either from the Republic or from a planet themselves to not only restore peace during a wartime, but also strengthen, especially if you see conflict happening around the galaxy. Do you think this was a subtle reminder? Because I think senators in the Senate would take this as a reason for increasing the Republic's budget to protect, planets that, because once again, it was just a coincidence that they were there to help out. But imagine all those planets where the separatists might just start a genocide out of nothing, right? So it's either definite is that you need soldiers to protect, but once again, to what extent should it just be on a state and local level? Are there other options? Maybe you don't need soldiers at all, and if it's the Republic's duty to do that, because obviously the Jedi are only so many. So was it
Yeah,
every planet gets a Jedi? I don't know.
there is something to be said about this. Each each planet that has an even somewhat successful ability to stay neutral um, had a military. And I think Mandalore is a good example because although Satine's policies um, um, like it didn't succeed in keeping the peace within her planet, as again it was her inability to directly handle the Death Watch that eventually was the end of her, and it was the end of peace on her planet. But she did have a military, and so that meant that if there were aggression by some foreign planet or by the separatists or by the republic, there is the option, although she didn't really take it, the option to use her forces to fight back. And one thing that I do gotta give some credit for is that when the the Death Watch, with the aid of Maul, finally came to invade Mandalore. I don't know if it was her specifically, but someone in her cabinet, and it might have been her, actually sent the army to fight it back. And so she did effectively use, or Mandalore, I don't know if it was her, Mandalore
Hmm.
used their army to defend their planet when it was absolutely necessary. The Lurmen did not have such a choice there because they had no army. Um, they did eventually fight back though, although not with support from their chief.
They didn't have blasters. Like actually, if it weren't for the Jedi and Rex and Cody, I think was also there. That no chance. That's why I mean, should every planet have a? Because I think they chose this planet, of innocent farmers to really uh, empathize not only with the characters, the people suffer under war, but also show, maybe there is kind of introduce that idea of you need soldiers. There's a reason why Jedi's turn into soldiers have to defend, because even if you believe in, because they're very optimistic in that view, where they believe if they say, look, we're not choosing sides, we don't want anything to do with it, they're going to be at peace. But obviously they're proven wrong, and they obviously needed protection then and might in the future. So they have to switch from a very optimistic to a more pessimistic point throughout the arc and towards the end when they're on the attack. So it really just goes back to the question where keepers of peace, Jedi, should they be soldiers? In this case, yes, they need to be soldiers, and the Jedi Council can look at this example and be like, look, this is reason why. Look what happened if we weren't soldiers in this scenario. The separatists weren't willing to negotiate. So as we already come to a conclusion over these over us talking, is that the the soldier they must be soldiers in these scenarios, and they have to be at peace to restore peace. I mean, at war to restore peace, and that's the eventual conclusion that we draw.
I think it definitely so, but then it also kind of depends on the foe that you face. The
Yeah.
separatists were very cruel in the sense that their weapon that they were planning on using without provocation was a weapon to inflict genocide. It wasn't, although it could be used to just fight against military targets, it could easily be used against a civilian population. And in the testing of this
Mm.
weapon, it was used against a civilian population, or at least it was
Yeah.
intended to. And so it really depends on the force that you're fighting. The force, in the separatist case, although there are times in where the good and bad is um, is blurred, you do see that very much so as the seasons go on in Clone Wars, because that's one theme of Clone Wars is that they, to a
Hmm.
certain extent, and for the most part, they actually stay very much one-sided in the view the Republic was good, the Separatists were bad, and this was definitely a part of this. As much as the Lurmen chief attacks the Republic for wanting to continue war, being forever warmongers, and failing in their goal of peacekeeping, they really did make it clear with this arc, as they did with most arcs up until about season 3 or 4, that the Republic
Mhm.
was right, separatists were wrong, because the separatists wanted to inflict genocide upon the Lurmen unprovoked. And so
Mhm.
if the separatists weren't so cruel, the model of not having an army could have worked. But because it didn't work, you're always going to walk away with the assumption that it would be best off to have an army to maintain the peace just in case. And
Yeah,
even if you were provoked, to be able to bring about peace again, without trading that peace, without trading the freedom of your people for peace, which is something that
mhm.
the Lurman chief would have done or was intending to do based off of his extremely pacifist principles.
Yeah. I thought the only critique I have of this arc is that I felt the evil was too textbook evil. There was no substance to it. It was I don't know why they wanted to test it out, why the Lurmen specifically, why now, why these Lurmen, why these people, and why this weapon, and how come. I thought that it lacked a bit of substance, as in Clone Wars didn't do a good job with this specific arc. They do later on, and when once they start this whole movement of sympathizing with the villain and understanding the separatist side, which there are arcs completely dedicated to bipartisanship and understanding why the separatists do what they do and how they feel like the Republic failed them. I thought this example was too plain and too simple. It was this, this fairy tale idea of the bad kill, obviously they were the bad people and obviously you need to fight them back. It was very simple and bland. That's the earliest stages of Clone Wars where it doesn't get too complex. So I thought that's why, yes, it's evident, but it kind of lacks substance. I don't know if you get what I'm talking about, but
So
I just felt that it wasn't complex. It wasn't realistic enough. Nobody nobody just starts a genocide just because they want to, you know. I mean, you look at Italy and Abyssinia, right? Obviously, but that was chauvinistically motivated, right? Maybe they could have added that. Maybe they thought these creatures weren't worth, they were too stupid to be kept alive or something like that. Something really arrogant and fascist, maybe even. But I just thought that was the only issue I really had with this arc, where they could have given some substance. Because we've seen in the real world why genocides happen. Civil unrest or political violence generally has several motivators and determinants. And I thought this incident lacked that. And that's why, as good as of an example it is, I do have to say that I think this example is a bit lackluster, and I think the Ryloth one we mentioned earlier is a bit more endearing and interesting to discuss. So,
there's an argument that because it's unrealistic, it that it only supports my side because it's unrealistic. There is an argument to be
mhm,
said there, and I'm open to admitting that, because every genocide in history um, um, is
personal,
it's
like
personal.
irrational.
Even with the worst genocides in history, it's not just done because they have to come up with some sort of like perversion of the truth. Even no genocide is justified, but every genocide involves some sort of manipulation of the truth, that
Hmm.
these people provoked us, that these people made us do this, that these people were going to come for us, and so we should do it first.
Yeah.
Um,
There needs to be some substantial reasoning. Right, exactly what
right.
you're saying.
Like the separatists never came to the Lurman planet saying, that these people, they're going to come to us first. These people, they hated us. These people, they deserved to be knocked out like this. It was very amoral. Like they were just kind of like, we need to test this
Yeah,
weapon, and these people are right
yeah,
here.
yeah. It was that basic. It wasn't even. They're just, people living. That's why, I thought it's just a bit more. That's why I'd rather talk about Ryloth, because I know you have a lot to say about that.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's a bit more endearing. And Sandula is a very interesting character who is a very revolutionary-esque character who reminds you a lot of the times of characters in real life that have, sparked revolutions and are change makers and trailblazers. So do you want to get into that?
Yeah, I mean, whatever time we got left, definitely. I think Sandula, he's worth a little more than 10 minutes, but in
No,
some,
yeah.
the analysis of Ryloth is can be summed up with the intention. When I think of Ryloth, I can't help but think about the 21 episode arc that Chad and I did on Peace v Freedom. Like I can't look at Ryloth without looking at the balance, or at least like the balance between peace and freedom. Because
Mm-hmm.
if Ryloth and Syndulla wanted peace, then he would stop fighting.
Mm-hmm.
But he couldn't stop fighting, because if he did stop fighting, then the freedom of his people would be thrown out into the wind. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and do keep in mind, his defense of the planet was very guerrilla in nature, or like semi-conventional. He didn't have support from the Republic until his people were literally starving. And so
Yeah.
he was definitely holding up the brunt of the defense of the planet. And at his command, he could, if he had loyal enough support, and I imagine he did, considering the crowds that he addressed once the war was over, and we saw in Bad Batch. Once the war was over, he had a lot of support. Ormfrey,
Mm-hmm.
Ryloth senator, was afraid of him because of how powerful he was. In a political sense, the people loved him. So I imagine he would have
Mm-hmm.
enough loyalty to where, if he gave a good enough of a speech saying that we just want peace, we can trust the separatists to offer it to us. We need to stop fighting, because peace needs to be brought again to Ryloth. This war is too much. Our people are starving. We
Mm-hmm.
need to stop fighting. Um, then he could do it, because of the influence that he had, because of the role that he had in the defense of the planet. The fact that he didn't do so is out of a recognition, one, that the separatists wouldn't respect that freedom, the freedom of his people, but then also because well, yeah, basically just because he didn't think that the separatists would respect that freedom. So
Mm-hmm.
I can't look at Syndulla and Ryloth without looking at peace v freedom.
Yeah. I mean, the whole arc, Ryloth, I mean, it spans not only the Clone Wars, but into the original trilogy, right? And there's so many side effects that, spun, because the Ryloth people are such an interesting. They have several arcs, right, throughout the Clone Wars, and you really explore the race. I forgot what the race is called. What are they called again?
The Twilight.
Uh, yeah, exactly. Twi'leks. And I mean, they deserve a whole episode in itself. There's so many like little details I could point out where, they have, for example, interesting accents, right, which hint a bit. I think they're a good example of their women are, sold as sex, slave workers. They're generally a very oppressed people. overall. And you can see he has that sort of by any means necessary attitude. And the senator during the Republic era, you know, he is a good example of, I think, failed government, because you can tell they made him fat for a reason. He's supposed to resemble that greediness and not care. He only cares for himself and the people around him to keep him in power. There's always something not right if you have a revolutionary guerrilla activist in your country and it's deemed a democracy, right? There's something awfully wrong with Ryloth, and that spans from separatist times into the Empire, where they've always been under some kind of siege, and that people have always been enslaved. I think slavery is something not talked about in the Star Wars forum as much as it should be. But there's so much to point out, and obviously we'll dive into a whole episode, I think, dedicated to Ryloth, that arc. Syndulla himself, who has inspiration from. I mean, just a quick side question, maybe, because we only have limited time left. But who do you think inspires the character? As in, what inspired the character of Syndulla, like revolutionary leaders? Because he
So
reminds me a bit of a like Fidel Castro, a bit from that aspect. As in, he stands up as a persona about him. I don't know. It just brings out to me a bit, but I don't know why. I don't know if you can draw any conclusions from that. Because he seems like a very familiar character, right? Like you've seen him on TV before, you've read in books about him. That freedom fighter, he fights for good. He has that, undeniable goodness in him.
I think about the Arab Revolt.
Arab Revolt.
Because like I do want to think about Che Guevara or Fidel Castro, but Saw Gerrera is meant to reflect Che Guevara.
No,
Um,
that's true. Yeah.
yeah, so like he deserves another episode within himself and Onderon, because there are multiple
Mm-hmm.
where Onderon is brought up and mentioned. It's the first place the Bad Batch is brought in the first couple episodes. And so
Mm-hmm.
and they have like continuing mentions of Saw Gerrera. He's in Andor, he's a continuing force. And so I think
Yeah.
like there's worth continued mentioning. And then like the not so subtle like attack by Luthen Rael during Andor of accusing, kind of laughing at Saw Gerrera, saying that he's an anarchist, saying that anarchism is not like the way to bring about peace and security to people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so he is meant to reflect Che Guevara, and the attack on him that Luthen Rael brought, even though it was a small moment in Andor, is definitely meant to kind of remind you of a communist revolutionary.
Yeah.
Um,
And
so
how dirty revolutions are in themselves. Yeah.
right, yeah, exactly. Like there's actually a YouTuber, Generation Tech,
No,
who
I just watched him before we got
he
on it. Brilliant
oh
guy.
man, he's been looking at politics and Star Wars in such a deep way. He's been looking at
Yeah.
Andor every single episode, almost every single character.
Yeah.
He's looking at deeply through a political lens. That's why when we do get to Saw Gerrera, when we do get to Andor, that's just gonna be fun,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, so when it comes to the connections with uh, um, with Che Guevara, Saw Gerrera more fits that description, or he's intended to fit
Yeah.
that description. He was made to.
True.
With Sandola, though, I relate it more to the Arab Revolt, and I don't have much
Yeah.
time to explain this, but for the Arab Revolt, I'd say because he was because he had this force that is going to sustain his revolution against authority,
Mm.
against like a an
Oppression.
force, and then when that the aid came, um, they they wanted to take them over, and then he ended up fighting against that authority. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll explain it more later, but you know, we'll get back for another episode on Star Wars politics, continuing this theme of peacekeeping. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
Khalil,
And I'm Luca.
and we are the Marshals of Truth.